Some ghosts walk not in graveyards, but in the jealous hearts of the living. Tonight's tale begins with whispers of a curse at Blackwood Hall, where flickering lights, forged letters, and a phantom cloaked in eerie glow threaten to drive an heir to madness. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. The case lies open before us now. Let us step into the ruins, where reason must contend with shadows. It was on a bleak November evening that I found myself once more in our familiar lodgings at Baker Street, the world beyond our windows obscured by a yellowish fog that pressed heavily against the glass. The lamplighters had long since departed, yet their work was rendered all but futile, for the mist seemed to swallow the faint glow of the street lamps as though it resented the intrusion of light into its murky dominion. Within, however, the fire burned steadily in the grate, casting its ruddy glow across the room and lending a measure of warmth to an otherwise inhospitable night. I remember well how the ticking of the clock seemed unusually loud in the hush that settled over our chambers. There was in the air that evening a curious stillness, as though London herself paused for breath, her countless wheels muffled beneath the veil of smoke and vapour. To a man such as myself, trained by long habit to observe Holmes's moods, the silence was far from unwelcome, for in such quiet moments, one might almost imagine the great detective at rest. Yet even as I gazed into the fire, I could not rid myself of the sense that some new matter would shortly disturb our tranquillity. It was as though the very fog outside bore secrets within its folds, pressing against the panes with insistent hands, and waiting but for the right hour to reveal them. My companion, far from sharing in my reflective mood, was wholly absorbed in one of his chemical experiments, his thin figure bent over a retort, the light catching on the sharp profile of his face, and his long, nervous fingers moved with a precision that betrayed both impatience and concentration. The acrid odour of burning chemicals filled the room, mingling with the more familiar scent of tobacco. Holmes muttered occasionally to himself, noting some minute for occupation. It was then, as if in answer to my unspoken thought, that a sudden, hurried knock sounded upon the street door below. The sharpness of it cut through the quiet like a pistol shot, causing me to start from my chair, while Holmes merely raised an eyebrow and set down his retort with deliberate care. "Mrs. Hudson's tread will shortly follow," he remarked dryly, "and behind it, if I am not mistaken, we shall have company of a most pressing nature. The hour is too late for the casual caller, Watson." He had scarcely finished speaking when the familiar shuffle of our landlady's steps ascended the stairs, followed by the creak of the door opening. There, upon the threshold, stood a young woman whose appearance bespoke both fatigue and agitation. Her cloak was damp from the mist, and she clutched it tightly about her, as though to guard against some unseen threat. Her face, pale beneath the brim of her travelling hat, bore traces of recent anxiety, and her eyes, wide and searching, fastened at once upon Holmes with an air of desperate hope. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" she asked, in a voice that trembled despite her effort to master it. "You have found him, madam," Holmes replied, inclining his head. "Pray be seated by the fire. The night is inhospitable, and your errand, I perceive, admits of no delay." Thus began an adventure which was to lead us far from the warmth of Baker Street, into the shadowed depths of Blackwood Hall. The young lady sank into the chair Holmes indicated, though it was plain her nerves would not allow her the comfort of stillness. Her gloved hands twisted upon one another in ceaseless agitation, and though she sought to compose herself, the tremor in her lips betrayed the extremity of her anxiety. "My name is Eliza Harrow," she began, her voice low yet hurried, "and I crave your indulgence for disturbing you at so late an hour." Holmes inclined his head, with that grave courtesy which he reserved for clients in distress. I, observing her more closely, could not but remark upon the refinement of her dress and manner. The fabric of her cloak, though damp from the fog, was of a quality not often seen outside respectable circles, and her speech bore none of the rusticity I might have expected from one lately come from the countryside. "You are most welcome, Miss Harrow," Holmes said. "Pray compose yourself. We are accustomed to nocturnal visitations, though not always of so urgent a complexion. Let me beg you to state your difficulty as plainly as you can." She clasped her hands tightly, as though summoning the courage to continue, and her eyes, bright with unshed tears, glanced from Holmes to myself and back again. "It concerns Blackwood Hall," she said at last, and at the mention of the name there seemed to fall upon the room an added weight of silence, as though even the fog pressing against our windows paused to listen. "My aunt, Lady Blackwood, has been much afflicted since the death of my uncle, Sir Reginald," Miss Harrow continued, her words now tumbling forth with the relief of confession. "The hall has become a place of terror. Lights have been seen glimmering in the gardens when all should be dark. Footsteps echo through the corridors at night, though none are abroad. More than once, a figure has been glimpsed near the chapel ruins, draped in what seemed to be funeral shrouds." She pressed her hands to her brow, her composure wavering under the memory. "The servants whisper of a family curse. They say Sir Reginald, who carried many sins unatoned, has returned to haunt his son. The staff have begun to desert us one by one, unable to endure the dread. Henry, Sir Reginald's heir, is greatly shaken, and I fear for his reason." Holmes, who had listened with folded hands and downcast eyes, now leaned forward a little. "And you yourself, Miss Harrow, have you witnessed these apparitions?" "I have heard the footsteps, Mr. Holmes, and once, only once, I saw a pale shape glide across the terrace by moonlight. I cannot say what manner of being it."
"Ghost of Sir Reginald will prove to possess a very material body." I ventured to remark that surely such confidence was premature, but Holmes only smiled faintly. "On the contrary, Watson, the facts already reveal themselves. Lights, footsteps, and shrouded figures are but the tools of mortal trickery. The true problem lies in discerning whose hand arranges them, and to what end. Miss Harrow, I shall accept your case. You may inform your cousin that Mr. Sherlock Holmes will himself investigate the secrets of Blackwood Hall." Her sigh of relief seemed almost to lift the fog from our chamber. The following morning found Holmes and myself upon the train that bore us steadily northward, the drab roofs of the city giving way to stretches of bleak countryside. November lay heavily upon the land. The hedgerows were bare, the fields sodden from recent rains, and the sky a low ceiling of lead that seemed to press upon the earth itself. I confess that the desolation of the scene worked upon my spirits, and I wondered what darker gloom might hang over the house to which we journeyed. Holmes, by contrast, was unusually silent. He leaned back in the corner of our compartment, eyes half closed, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. At intervals, I glimpsed the faintest tightening of his lips, a sure sign that his mind was engaged upon some inward calculation. "You are considering the case," I ventured. He inclined his head. "I am considering the mind that devised these manifestations, Watson. Ghosts are rarely of the other world. More often they are conjured from envy, resentment, or greed. The question is, whose hand finds advantage in such illusions?" I pressed him for more, but he merely shook his head, and the silence returned, broken only by the rumble of the train as it bore us nearer to Blackwood Hall. It was late afternoon when the carriage that had met us at the station turned a corner of the lane, and the first sight of Blackwood Hall came into view. The estate rose from amidst a tangle of ancient oaks,
its walls smothered in ivy that clung like a dark shroud to every stone. Tall chimneys jutted against the grey sky, while most of the windows were shuttered, giving the house the air of a fortress abandoned to decay. Even the horses seemed reluctant as we approached, their breath steaming in the cold air. I confess that a shiver ran through me, though I sought to attribute it to the chill rather than to the oppressive countenance of the place. "There," said Holmes quietly, his gaze fixed upon the looming facade. "Observe, Watson. A house meant to inspire awe has been allowed to lapse into neglect. Such settings are fertile soil for superstition. It is but a stage awaiting its phantom." The carriage drew up before a flight of worn steps, and as the door was opened for us, I felt as though the heavy shadow of the hall fell upon us both. We were about to enter a theatre where fear itself had been given form. We were received at the threshold by Henry Blackwood, the new master of the estate, and never have I seen a man so ill-suited to his inheritance. He was of slender build, his complexion pale to the point of translucence, and his eyes bore the strained look of one long accustomed to sleepless nights. His hand, when it clasped mine, trembled perceptibly, and I perceived in his manner a nervous energy bordering upon collapse. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice low and hurried, "I thank heaven you have come. You cannot know what terror has overtaken this house since my father's passing." Holmes inclined his head with a composure that seemed to steady the young man. "Terror thrives in silence, Sir Henry. Let us hear plainly what troubles you." As he led us into the draughty hall, Henry glanced fearfully toward the shadowed staircase. "It is at night that the torment begins," he whispered. "I hear my father's tread in the corridors, heavy and deliberate, as in life. More than once I have seen his figure upon the landing, his face pale, his eyes accusing." I confess I felt a chill at his words, though Holmes merely regarded nocturnal terrors. One maid swore she had heard the tread of boots along the upper passage when none were abroad. Another described the sudden slamming of doors, though the corridors had been empty to her sight. Most vivid of all was the testimony of a footman, who declared that he had seen a figure, tall, shrouded, and indistinct, drifting down the staircase by the light of the moon. His voice faltered as he recounted it, and his hands shook as though the memory still clung to him. Their fear was unmistakable, and their tales consistent in detail, yet I could not help but feel a measure of doubt. Still, it was plain that the atmosphere of dread hung heavily over the household, and each narrative added another stone to the edifice of terror in which young Henry Blackwood seemed imprisoned. When I rejoined Holmes, I found him listening with grave patience to a yet older account. The narrator on this occasion was an aged retainer, one whose bent figure and trembling hands spoke of many years in the service of the family. He began in a hushed tone, as though the very walls of the house might resent the telling. "It has always been thus with the Blackwoods," he said. "There is blood on this name, sir. A great-grandfather who fell in a duel over a dishonourable affair. A brother who drank himself into the grave amidst debts and disgrace. And Sir Reginald himself, God rest his soul, who carried many enemies into eternity with him." The man's watery eyes glistened as he leaned closer. "They say a curse clings to this house, that each generation must pay for the sins of the last. Sir Reginald swore, on his deathbed, that none would find peace beneath this roof, and I believe his spirit has returned to make good his oath." The effect of these words upon the servants was profound. Several crossed themselves, while others muttered prayers under their breath. I could see that Henry Blackwood, pale and drawn, had sunk deeper into his chair as the tale unfolded, his lips moving as though in silent protest or prayer. Holmes, however, regarded the speaker with a calm that was almost disconcerting. His eyes, half-lidded, seemed to look beyond the man and his story, as though searching for the single thread of truth hidden among the tangle of superstition and fear. When the last murmur of the old man's tale had faded, Holmes rose and approached the hearth. He stood for a moment with his back to us, his tall frame outlined against the firelight, before turning with a sudden energy that startled even me. "Sir Henry," said he, fixing the young heir with that penetrating gaze which few men could withstand. "You have told us of footsteps, of visions, of apparitions in the corridors. I must press you now. Did you yourself ever hear your father's voice?" Henry's pallor deepened. "No," he stammered. "Only the tread of his boots and the sight of his form." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "And these sounds, at what hour do they occur?" "Always between midnight and 2, Henry replied. Holmes nodded slightly, his fingers drumming against the mantel. "You will forgive me, but I observe some irregularity in your statement. You claimed earlier that you saw the figure upon the landing by moonlight. Yet tonight's moon would not fall upon that portion of the stair. Did you not rather see it by lamplight? Or perhaps by the glow of some other artificial means?" Henry faltered, his eyes darting away. I cannot be sure. The terror overcame me." "Precisely," Holmes murmured. "Terror clouds perception. We shall rely instead upon fact." He resumed his seat, his manner composed. To the casual listener, his tone might have seemed dismissive, but I knew my friend too well. He had already begun to piece together the pattern beneath these phantoms. Where the household saw a curse, Holmes perceived only shadows cast by human design, and he meant to drag them into the light. Sir Henry, if I may so call him, though the title sat uneasily upon his fragile bearing, pressed our hands in thanks, his expression one of mingled relief and anxiety. Holmes offered a word or two of reassurance, but I noticed how his eyes darted quickly across the hall, noting details of stonework, tapestry, and dust, with that same restless precision which had so often led us to the heart of a mystery. Thus did we cross the threshold into the drama that awaited us. We were ushered shortly thereafter into the dining chamber, a vast apartment whose sombre aspect chilled me more than the wintry air. A long table, laid for but a handful of persons, stretched beneath a ceiling lost in shadow, while from the walls the portraits of stern-faced ancestors gazed down with a scrutiny that seemed almost alive. Their painted eyes, glinting in the uncertain lamplight, followed every movement of the living, as though to judge whether the present generation proved worthy of their inheritance. The household itself was meagre. Besides Henry Blackwood, there remained only his aunt, a gaunt lady whose face bore the stamp of prolonged anxiety, and 2 or 3 silent retainers who moved with furtive steps, as if fearful of disturbing some slumbering spirit. Conversation lagged, broken only by the clatter of cutlery and the sigh of the draughts that crept beneath the door. Holmes, for his part, was more affable than I might have expected. He spoke lightly of the countryside and of our journey, though I noted the quick, appraising glances he directed at Henry's trembling hand and the lines of strain about his mouth. For myself, I confess that the oppressive air of the room pressed upon me so heavily that I could scarce enjoy the meal set before us. I was glad indeed when the solemn ritual drew to its close. When the household dispersed, I took the opportunity to mingle for a time with the servants, hoping to glean some fragment of truth from their hushed conversations. They gathered in corners, their voices scarcely above a whisper, as though even the walls might betray them. One maid swore she had heard a door slam violently in the upper corridor when no one was abroad. Another spoke of muffled footsteps trailing her as she passed along the gallery, though when she turned, there had been only the emptiness of the hall. Most chilling was the account of a stable boy, who averred that, glancing toward the chapel ruins at dusk, he had glimpsed a figure white as a winding sheet gliding among the stones. Their tales, though varying in detail, all pointed to the same conclusion in their minds, that the spirit of the late Sir Reginald had returned to torment his heir. I confess that the conviction in their tones, joined to the sombre gloom of the house itself, worked upon my imagination. I should have been less than human had I not felt a shiver of unease. Holmes, however, listened with an expression that bordered on amusement. "Observe, Watson," he murmured as we withdrew. "Fear is the greatest of stage managers. It supplies actors, scenery, and audience all in one. Yet the play remains of human contrivance." With that remark, he turned to the staircase, leaving me to follow with mixed relief and apprehension. It was as we sat later that evening in the library, the hour creeping toward midnight, that my eye was drawn to the tall windows which looked out upon the garden. The night was still, the moon veiled by drifting mist, when suddenly I perceived a faint and wandering glow among the trees. At first I thought it some trick of my tired vision, but as I leaned forward, it grew clearer, wavering like a lantern borne by an unsteady hand. "Holmes," I whispered, pointing toward the glass. He was beside me in an instant, his gaze sharpening at the sight. Without hesitation, he drew on his cloak. "Come, Watson. This play has moved into its second act. We shall take the stage." Henry Blackwood, who had joined us in the library, uttered a low cry. "It is he! My father walks again." His features contorted, loomed as though in silent watch. Yet it was not sight but sound that unnerved me most. Strange echoes seemed to drift across the lawn, whispers without source, creaks as of ancient timbers shifting, and, most uncanny of all, the distant toll of a bell. "Holmes," I murmured, clutching at his sleeve. "Did you hear it? A bell. Yet there is no tower here." Holmes inclined his head. "The ear is an honest witness, Watson, though it may be misled by distance and design. Let us not yield too quickly to fancy." The toll came again, hollow and irregular, borne upon the wind from the direction of the ruined chapel. It sent a chill through me deeper than the night air, for it carried with it the suggestion of ritual, as though the dead themselves summoned us to their service. Holmes halted, crouching to study the ground by the light of his lantern. "Observe," he said quietly, "the crushed grass and these impressions. Someone, or something more solid than spirit, has passed this way not an hour since." His calm voice steadied me somewhat, though I could not wholly banish the image of phantom bells and unseen watchers. The glow ahead flickered once more, drawing us inexorably onward. At last we emerged from the line of trees into the open ground before the chapel. There, half shrouded in mist and moonlight, stood a figure. It was tall, wrapped in pale garments that seemed to shimmer faintly, as though endowed with their own unearthly light. The glow which had first drawn us thither emanated from the folds of its cloak, casting a sickly radiance upon the crumbling stones. I felt the blood drain from my face. "Holmes," I whispered hoarsely. "In heaven's name, what is it?" The figure moved with slow, gliding steps across the grass, its head inclined as though in sorrow. For a moment, the resemblance to the late Sir Reginald was so strong that I nearly cried out. Every instinct in me urged flight, and my hand strayed instinctively to the revolver at my side. Holmes, however, remained composed, his eyes fixed intently upon the apparition. "Mark the pace, Watson," he said softly. "Too measured for a phantom, yet most convenient for scrutiny." As we watched, the figure drifted toward the ruined doorway of the chapel and, without sound, vanished into the shadows within. The night closed about us once more, leaving the air heavy with dread and mystery. We returned in silence to the house, Henry clinging to my arm as though the strength of another might preserve his sanity. Once within, Holmes offered him a word or two of reassurance and withdrew to his chamber, his manner calm, almost indifferent, as though he had merely witnessed a common stage performance. For my own part, I retired unsettled. The echo of that ghostly bell still lingered in my ears, and the vision of the shrouded figure haunted my mind's eye. I prided myself on being a man of science and reason, yet I could not wholly shake the impression that we had looked upon something beyond mortal ken. As I lay awake in my cold chamber, the wind rattling the casements, I envied Holmes his composure. His words at parting, "Fear is ever the ally of deception, Watson," had been spoken with such certainty, but I longed to share his confidence. Yet sleep, when it came at last, was broken and troubled. And more than once I woke with the uneasy conviction that unseen eyes still watched from the darkness. The dawn that followed our strange vigil broke sharp and clear, the fog of the previous evening dispersed by a biting frost. From my chamber window, I beheld the lawns of Blackwood Hall gleaming white, every blade of grass stiffened and glittering beneath the touch of winter's hand. The air was keen, so that each breath cut the lungs like a draught of ice, and sounds, even the cawing of distant rooks, carried with a startling clarity across the there to examine the smallest depression. I confess that my untrained vision could discern little beyond the beauty of the frozen scene, yet in every brittle tuft of grass and every faint scuff upon the gravel, Holmes appeared to find significance. He tapped lightly with his cane, scraped at the whitened soil, and muttered to himself with a satisfaction I had seen only when a case was beginning to yield its secrets. "Observe here, Watson," he called presently. "The mark of a boot, broad in the sole, yet shallow in depth. A man of middle weight, passing at speed." He gestured toward a line half hidden by frost, where indeed I could just make out a series of impressions. "Last night's phantom, then?" I asked. Holmes's lips twitched. "Phantoms leave no prints, my dear fellow. And yet, here they are, as tangible as your own." We followed the track as it curved away across the lawn, each step recorded with startling precision upon the frozen earth, and leading us steadily toward the shadow of the ruined chapel. For some distance the trail was clear and unbroken, the crisp outlines of the boots standing boldly upon the white grass. Holmes followed with an eagerness that carried me along in his wake, his tall figure bending now and again as he confirmed the direction. The prints moved straight toward the chapel, as though their maker had been intent upon reaching that desolate structure without pause. Yet at the very edge of the broken stones, the miracle occurred. Where the frost yielded to harder ground, the line faltered, dwindled, and suddenly was gone. We circled the spot in widening sweeps, but though the soil was bare of frost, no further trace appeared. It was as though the figure had stepped boldly into the air and vanished. I stared, my heart thudding. "Surely, Holmes, this passes beyond reason. No living man could contrive such disappearance."
He regarded the ground with narrowed eyes. "You are correct, Watson. Yet nature does not permit of vanishing. Every exit must have its entrance, every end its means. The prints stop, therefore they resume elsewhere. It is for us to bridge the gap." His gaze shifted to the ruined wall, where mossy stones bore faint marks as though brushed by cloth. "Note," he murmured, "how even silence and shadow may betray the careless. The solution lies close at hand." Despite his words, I could not banish from my mind the eerie image of the figure we had seen, gliding through the mist, and of prints that ended as suddenly as a dream upon waking. Holmes paced slowly before the chapel wall, his keen eyes sweeping over the weathered stones. The ruin, overgrown with moss and lichen, seemed to my eye but the natural work of centuries. Yet I saw his expression sharpen as he crouched beside a cluster of flagstones, half hidden in shadow. "Observe here, Watson," he said, pointing with the tip of his cane. "The moss is bruised, and here, see? A faint scuff upon the stone itself." I bent low, straining to discern what his more practiced sight had already grasped. Indeed,
There was a disturbance. Slight abrasions as though a boot had brushed the surface while seeking careful purchase. My imagination, still haunted by the phantom of the night before, rebelled. But surely, Holmes, if the tracks cease here and reappear nowhere beyond, what alternative remains save that the figure left the ground altogether? The words escaped me before I could recall them, and I flushed at their childish ring. Holmes's lips curved faintly. Levitation, Watson? An enviable gift, yet less probable than a simple stratagem. Depend upon it, no man leaves no trace. If the ground denies us, the wall may tell another tale. His fingers brushed lightly across the stonework, and I perceived the subtle shift from the supernatural to the rational, though my own nerves were not yet wholly calmed. It was a few paces beyond that Holmes uttered a quiet exclamation and stooped swiftly. There, pressed into the frozen soil, lay the stub of a candle, half consumed, its wax hardened in curious rivulets where it had guttered in the night air. "Ah," Holmes murmured with satisfaction, holding the fragment delicately between finger and thumb. "Our phantom is
observed. This evidence does not lessen the terror of those who behold it. The apparition was convincing enough to chill my own blood." Holmes rose, slipping the stub carefully into his pocket. "Quite so, Watson. The human eye is ever the servant of expectation. Show it a shroud and a glow, and it will furnish the ghost to fit. But note, our quarry grows careless. Wax upon grass is a poor confidant. It tells tales when the lips remain silent." He turned his gaze along the faint trail, already calculating where it might lead. Holmes stood with hands clasped behind his back, his eyes sweeping the ruin and the surrounding lawn, as though surveying a battlefield after combat. The frost still clung in patches, but where it had melted beneath the candle's heat or the passage of a foot, he noted each disturbance with a swift precision that left me marvelling. "Consider, Watson," he said at length, "the illusion we witnessed. A figure clothed in pale garments, emitting a glow that seemed otherworldly, appearing and vanishing at will. Now add to this the evidence of footprints, scuffed stone, and a candle discarded in haste. Do you not perceive the mechanism?" I hesitated. "Then the ghost is no ghost at all, but some mortal in disguise." "Precisely. The glow is artificial, the garments contrived. A man may move unseen within these grounds by means of passages or shadow, and when revealed, cloak himself in the semblance of the departed Sir Reginald." "And yet," I pressed, "to what end? Why torment Henry with such apparitions?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. "That, my dear fellow, is the crux. Trickery is but the instrument. Motive is the hand that wields it. Whether it be to drive the heir from his estate, to mask some clandestine design, or to satisfy a darker grudge, we cannot yet say. But of this you may be assured. The dead do not walk. It is ever the living who trouble us most." His words carried a quiet certainty. Yet as we turned back toward the hall, I could not wholly rid myself of the shiver left by the memory of that spectral glow. It was during our inquiries in the village that the name of Madame Céline first arose, spoken in tones that betrayed both awe and apprehension. Every shopkeeper, every cottager seemed to have heard of her exploits. She was said to commune with the dead, to summon their very voices from beyond the veil, and to reveal secrets known only to the departed. In an ordinary season, such talk might have been dismissed as rural fancy. Yet the recent terrors at Blackwood Hall lent weight to her reputation, and the villagers spoke as though she were but an extension of the haunting itself. "She called up my mother's voice," whispered an old woman with trembling hands, "clear as though she stood in the room with me." Another insisted that Madame Céline had foretold the loss of a neighbour's cow with uncanny accuracy. Everywhere we turned, the name returned to us, cloaked in fear and reverence. I confess that I felt an unease growing in my own breast, for it seemed to me that, if this woman trafficked in deception, she held dangerous sway over minds already unbalanced by superstition. Holmes, however, listened to these accounts with a faint, ironic smile, his eyes glittering with that cold amusement which heralded a challenge worthy of his talents. That very afternoon, as though our interest had been anticipated, a note arrived at the hall. It bore a florid hand and an unfamiliar seal, inviting Henry Blackwood to attend a sitting with Madame Céline that same evening. The letter promised comfort for the afflicted heir, and a message, so it claimed, from his departed father. Henry's hands shook as he read it. "I cannot," he murmured. "I dare not hear what voice might issue from that darkness." Holmes relieved him of the note and examined it closely. "The hand is feminine, yet schooled to an artificial elegance," he remarked. "Observe the blot at the base, written in haste, not calm conviction. Watson, it seems our phantom grows theatrical," turning to by the occasional crackle of the wicks. Into this scene glided Madame Céline. She was a tall woman, her features severe, her eyes gleaming in the half-light with a strange intensity. Draped in sombre garments that seemed to absorb the glow, she carried herself with the slow assurance of one accustomed to command the emotions of her audience. She raised her hands, and the murmurs fell away. "Sir Reginald Blackwood," she intoned, her voice low and sonorous. "If your spirit lingers among us, give us a sign." At once, a faint rustle stirred the air, and I could have sworn I heard a whisper pass behind my chair. The woman beside me gasped, her hands clutching at the table's edge. Another sitter let fall a sob. Then, with dreadful clarity, a hollow voice echoed through the chamber. "Henry Blackwood." The sound was such that my own blood ran cold, for it carried the timbre of a man's speech, distorted yet unmistakably human. All eyes turned wide with fear, and several crossed themselves. Holmes alone remained impassive. I felt his hand brush against mine under the table, steady, deliberate. A silent command that I should master my own nerves. His gaze was fixed, not on the ceiling or the shadows, but upon Madame Céline herself, as though he sought the source of the trick, even as the others trembled before its effect. It would be idle to deny that I felt a tremor of unease as the darkness deepened in Madame Céline's chamber. The circle of sitters clutched one another's hands. Their shallow breaths seemed to beat in rhythm with the guttering of the candles. Each flicker threw grotesque shadows upon the wall, so that I could scarce tell whether the figures around me were of flesh or smoke. Yet when I glanced at Holmes, I found him composed. His eyes narrowed, his lips curved in that half-smile which heralded discovery. While the others gazed upward in dread, his attention roved quietly about the room. I saw him follow a faint glimmer of wire that disappeared into the folds of a curtain. His nostrils flared slightly, as though catching some odour imperceptible to my coarser senses. Later, in the cool light of reason, he informed me of all he had discerned. The thin, silken wires that swayed the table, the concealed trumpet, cunningly fashioned to direct whispers into hollow resonance, and, most damning of all, the faint, acrid scent of phosphorus, mingling with the incense, intended to lend an unearthly glow to the pale draperies of the medium. At the time, however, I confess my imagination was too enthralled by the uncanny atmosphere to profit from these observations. Each sigh of the curtains seemed a spirit's breath, and each tremor of the table set my pulse to racing. It was a relief when the next phase of the charade began, though it brought with it new disquiet. The voice, when it came, was hollow and sepulchral, and so startlingly clear that a murmur of terror ran through the company. "Henry Blackwood," it intoned, the syllables drawn out as though by one who speaks from the grave. Leave this house, abandon the hall, or ruin shall be your lot.
Several of the sitters cried out, and one fainted outright. The candles guttered as though in sympathy, and the oppressive air of the room thickened until I scarce drew breath. I felt an involuntary chill run through me, for there was something dreadful in the precise naming of our host. This was no vague admonition such as a trickster might devise to cover all cases, but a message, sharp as a dagger, aimed at the heart of our young client. I turned to Holmes, expecting to find even his iron composure shaken. To my astonishment, he was leaning back in his chair, his fingers steepled before him, his expression one of almost playful curiosity. "Note, Watson," he whispered, "how conveniently the dead concern themselves with matters of inheritance." The voice rose again, this time in tones of menace. "Henry Blackwood, your father walks. Beware his wrath." At this, a cry broke from several throats, and the medium herself collapsed against the table in apparent exhaustion. Yet Holmes's eyes gleamed more brightly than ever, and I knew he had pierced the veil of deception. The effect was electric. Some rose indignantly, others in relief, and a few in shame at their own credulity. Madame Selene advanced upon Holmes with a torrent of protestations, declaring that her powers were genuine and that he had profaned sacred mysteries. Holmes regarded her coolly. "Your mysteries, madam, are of the carpenter's shop and the chemist's bench. You are but an instrument in hands larger than your own. Pray tell us, who engaged you to terrify the heir of Blackwood Hall?" Her lips tightened, and she offered no reply. Yet from her silence Holmes drew the confirmation he required, and I perceived that he regarded her not as the author of the plot, but as its hired accomplice. The following morning broke bleak and colourless, the frost still clinging to the lawns, though the sun strove faintly to pierce the haze. Within the gloomy corridors of Blackwood Hall, I encountered Henry Blackwood pacing with restless steps, his face drawn and his eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. His hands trembled as he pressed them together, and he started at the faintest sound, as though each creak of the timbers heralded some unseen presence. "Another night, Dr. Watson," he murmured in a low, hoarse voice, "and still the same phantoms torment me. I cannot endure it much longer." I sought to reassure him, speaking of Holmes's steady progress, but the young man scarcely seemed to hear. His gaze was fixed upon the darkened windows, and he carried about him that peculiar air of one living less in the present than in the shadow of memory. It was plain that terror had taken firm hold of his reason, and I feared that even the strongest proof might scarce deliver him from its grip. Holmes appeared at that moment, keen-eyed and brisk, and beckoned Henry into the library. His manner, so calm and precise, seemed a tonic in itself. I followed, anxious lest the strain should overcome our client entirely. Holmes seated himself by the hearth, his figure composed yet alert, and fixed Henry with that penetrating gaze which no man could long withstand. "Pray, Mr. Blackwood," said he, "describe with exactitude the nature of these visitations. Spare us no detail, however trivial it may appear." The young man shifted uneasily, his voice faltering. "I see him, my father. He stands in the gallery or by the chapel door, clothed as in life, though his face is pale as the grave. He warns me to quit the house, that ruin awaits should I remain." Holmes inclined his head. "And these appearances, do they occur at regular intervals, or are they wholly irregular?" Henry hesitated. "Irregular, I think, though most often at nightfall." "Indeed, and you are quite alone when these visions appear?" Again a pause, then a halting, "Yes, alone." Yet his tone was unsteady. and I could not but notice how his eyes flickered toward the window, avoiding Holmes's steady scrutiny. Holmes pressed him gently but firmly with further queries, and at each turn I observed subtle contradictions. An uncertainty of place or hour, a confusion of detail. I marvelled at Holmes's patience, for he seemed content to let the web tighten about the young man, until, at last, Henry sank into his chair with a sigh of defeat. "There is more, Mr. Holmes," he said at length, his voice scarcely audible. "Something I had hoped never to show you." With trembling fingers, Henry produced from his breast pocket a packet of folded papers, tied with a frayed ribbon. His face was pallid as he laid them upon the table, and his hands shook so violently that I feared he might collapse before our eyes. "They come to me by night," he whispered, "slipped beneath my door or left upon my pillow. Each is in my father's hand. I would swear to it upon oath." Holmes untied the bundle and spread the letters carefully before him. The script, bold and unmistakable, leapt from the page with chilling familiarity. "Henry Blackwood," one began, "you usurp what is not rightfully yours. Leave this hall, or the grave shall claim you as it claimed." Thoughtful, I could see that he was already tracing the chain which linked spectral vision, candle in the grass, and now these missives from the grave. I took one of the papers in my hand, and as my eyes fell upon the bold, sweeping characters, I confess a shiver ran the length of my spine. There, upon the page, stood the very hand of Sir Reginald Blackwood. A hand I had seen in ledgers and documents about the hall. Each loop and flourish bore the weight of familiarity. The slant of the letters was unmistakable. It was as though the dead baronet himself had risen from his grave to pen this dire admonition. Though my reason warned me against such fancies, I could not wholly banish them from my mind. In the hush of the gloomy chamber, with the pale morning light struggling through the draped windows, it seemed no great leap to imagine that death itself had lent its pen to warn the living. I turned to Holmes, who was bent intently over another sheet, his features calm, his eyes bright with interest. He caught my glance and smiled faintly. "Your medical training, Watson, does not extend to handwriting," said he, "or you would find less to trouble you here. Still, I do not reproach you. Even the strongest intellect may quail when fear wears the mask of the familiar." I said nothing, for I could not shake the chill that had seized me. Henry sat hunched forward, his face buried in his hands, while the damning letters lay spread across the table before him. His silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional tremor that shook his frame. At last he raised his head, and I was startled by the look of anguish in his hollow eyes. "It is not only the handwriting," he said hoarsely. "It is the words, the very turn of phrase. My father spoke thus in anger, with that same bitterness. It is as though he still rebukes me from beyond the grave." Holmes leaned forward. "You speak as one who carries a burden, Mr. Blackwood. If there is aught in your conscience that lends force to these phantoms, you would do well to share it. Concealment aids only your enemies." Henry's lips moved, but no sound emerged. He struggled visibly, as though some weight pressed upon him. Yet the confession would not come. At last he whispered, "There were disputes between us. Matters of inheritance, of duty. Harsh words were spoken. He died before I could make amends. Perhaps this is my punishment." Holmes's gaze sharpened, but his tone remained even. "Punishment is seldom meted by the grave, sir. The living, not the dead, are the authors of persecution. Still, you have betrayed something of value. Guilt is the lever upon which your tormentor presses. Someone knew of these quarrels, and now turns them into weapons against you." Henry groaned and once more bowed his head in despair. Holmes drew the letters closer and produced his lens, his fingers moving with that feline delicacy which marked his most engrossed investigations. He placed one sheet beside another, then withdrew from his pocket a document from the Hall's records, bearing Sir Reginald's signature. "Note, Watson," he said, beckoning me nearer, "the curious uniformity of these threats. The downward strokes are all of identical pressure, as though guided by calculation rather than the natural variations of a living hand. Sir Reginald's writing, by contrast, shows vigour in one word, fatigue in another, a true man's script, with the play of temper and circumstance. Here the tremor is too even. That betrays artifice." I bent over the pages, yet to my untrained eye the differences seemed vanishingly small. "You see ghosts where I see the hand of a dead man," I confessed. Holmes smiled. "On the contrary, I see a very living forger, possessed of skill, but lacking the spontaneity of truth. Look again. The letters K and D are formed with an angularity foreign to the baronet's genuine hand. And here, observe the ink. It is fresh, modern, scarcely a fortnight old. Do you suppose the grave yields ink bottles and quills?" I could not help but smile altogether. Holmes, however, stood unmoved, his eyes fixed with quiet intensity upon our client. "No, Mr. Blackwood," said he firmly. "You are not doomed. You are persecuted, and the hand that persecutes you is one that I mean to unmask." The library at Blackwood Hall was a chamber of sombre dignity, its tall shelves crammed with volumes that bore the dust of centuries. Yet on that evening, as the last embers glowed faintly upon the hearth, it seemed to me less a sanctuary of learning than a room that guarded secrets. Holmes stood in the half-light, his long fingers drumming lightly upon the arm of his chair, his gaze roving with that restless energy I had come to recognize as the prelude to discovery. "There is something amiss here, Watson," he murmured at length. "These walls conceal more than books." I started at the remark, for the silence of the room had weighed heavily upon me, though I could not have named the cause. The stillness was profound, broken only by the occasional creak of the old timbers, as if the house itself strained to keep some confidence. Holmes rose suddenly, his expression alert. "Bring your lamp nearer. The hall has been generous with its legends, but I fancy it will soon yield a fact." Holmes moved to the far end of the chamber, where a row of dark oak panelling rose to the ceiling. He began to pass slowly along its length, tapping here and there with the ferrule of his cane, his ear cocked for the faintest variation of sound. Presently he paused. "Hollow," he said softly, "and most obligingly so." I approached, holding the lamp aloft. To my eyes the wood appeared no different from its fellows. Yet Holmes's hand traced lightly along the edge until it encountered a seam too narrow for casual notice. He pressed firmly, and with a reluctant groan, the section of panelling shifted upon hidden hinges. The gust of stale air issued forth, redolent of damp stone and disuse. Behind us, the gloom of the library seemed suddenly less oppressive than the darkness that yawned within. Holmes's eyes shone with quiet triumph. "There, Watson, every legend of a haunted house demands its secret door. This one is no exception. Shall we?" I confess I hesitated, for the black aperture appeared more like the mouth of a tomb than any human passageway. Yet Holmes, without further parley, had already drawn his candle and struck a light, the small flame gleaming defiantly against the void. The flame cast a narrow circle of light as we stepped within, the panel closing behind us with a dull thud that seemed to seal us into another world. The passage stretched before us in oppressive silence, its walls of rough stone sweating with damp, its floor thick with dust, save where faint scuffs showed that others had passed before us. Holmes advanced steadily,
his candle held high, his keen eyes scanning each mark upon the ground. "Note, Watson," he observed, stooping to indicate a smear upon the stone, "how the dust has been disturbed by boots of differing sizes, one heavy, one light, suggestive of a man and perhaps a youth, or a man encumbered in disguise. This way has seen frequent traffic of late." I bent closer, the chill of the air raising the hairs at the back of my neck. "And yet the air is so close," I murmured. "It cannot have been truly abandoned." "Precisely," Holmes replied. "A passage preserved for a purpose. We shall discover soon enough what that purpose is." The corridor twisted and narrowed, the ceiling low enough to force me to stoop, and the silence was broken only by the drip of unseen moisture. At length we came upon a stone stair descending into deeper gloom. Holmes paused, the candlelight glinting off his sharp features. "Take courage, my dear Watson," he said with a faint smile. "Every labyrinth conceals its minotaur. Ours, I suspect, awaits below." The narrow passage sloped gently, its damp walls narrowing so that we were forced to proceed in single file. The air was close and heavy, thick with the scent of mould, and I confess I felt a chill, as though we trespassed where none but the dead had trodden. Holmes, however, pressed on, with steps seemed laden with menace, and I found myself glancing back more than once, half expecting some silent follower in the gloom. Holmes, meanwhile, continued with the calm assurance of a man who had glimpsed the outline of his quarry. The passage twisted sharply, descending by uneven steps that glistened with damp. We pressed onward, the candle's glow throwing monstrous shadows upon the walls, until at last a breath of colder air met us, bearing with it the faint odour of earth and decay. Holmes quickened his pace, and soon we reached a narrow aperture. He pressed aside a screen of crumbling masonry, and, to my astonishment, we emerged behind the ruined altar of the chapel. From the nave, the stones appeared solid, yet from within, the concealment was artfully contrived, a cunning contrivance of ancient masons, perhaps intended for flight in troubled times, now turned to baser uses. The moonlight filtering through the broken roof cast long shafts across the floor, illuminating the shattered pews and ivy-grown walls. It was a desolate scene, haunted by more than superstition. I could scarce imagine a fitter stage for spectral pageantry. Holmes held the candle low, scrutinizing every inch of the flagstones. "Consider, Watson," he murmured. "The apparition we beheld last night vanished precisely here. It did not dissolve into air, but withdrew by this hidden path. Thus the ghost walks when it wills, and none are the wiser." I felt a stirring of relief at his words, for though dread still pressed upon me, it was comforting to hear such sober reason applied to the mystery. Yet the very cunning of the deception bespoke a mind not only resourceful, but relentless, and I could not help but wonder to what lengths such an adversary might yet go. It was as Holmes bent to examine a corner of the altar that I started at the sudden flicker of his candle. He had stooped low, and now he straightened, holding in his hand a small, dark fragment of cloth. "See here, Watson," said he, his voice quick with triumph. "A portion of a cloak, torn where it caught upon the stone. And note the texture. It is coarse, not the fine cloth of Sir Reginald's wardrobe. Our spectre dresses cheaply for one of noble lineage." I took the scrap and turned it in my fingers. It was rough, dark wool, frayed at the edge where it had ripped. My heart quickened, for it was tangible proof that the phantom was but flesh and blood. Holmes's eyes gleamed as he bent once more to the floor. There he retrieved the charred head of a match, blackened yet recent. He held it up to the light. "Burnt here," he declared. "The air is too stagnant to have preserved it long. Our visitor has been here within hours, Watson, perhaps even while we supped."
I confess the thought made me glance sharply about the ruin, half expecting the cloaked figure to rise from the shadows. The wind moaned faintly through the broken arches, and the ivy rustled as though stirred by unseen hands. Holmes, however, slipped the cloth and match into his pocket with cool composure. "We have stripped the ghost of its veil," he said. "Now it remains to uncover the hand that directs it. Come, there is more yet to learn." It was late in the evening when Holmes, having paced the hall for some time in silent thought, turned to me with sudden decision. His eyes gleamed in the lamplight, and his voice carried that quiet authority which left no room for argument. "Watson," said he, "the masquerade reaches its crisis. If our adversary means to parade his phantom, he will do so under cover of night, in the chapel where Fear lends him his greatest power. Tonight we shall keep vigil there, and before dawn we shall know the truth." Henry Blackwood, who sat huddled in an armchair, uttered a cry of alarm. "You cannot! The spirit strikes at night. No mortal man could face it and live." Holmes regarded him with measured patience. "Spirits, Mr. Blackwood, do not trouble themselves with matches and candle ends. I beg you, rest easy. The enemy we seek is of flesh and blood, though he cloaks himself in phosphorescence." I confess my own heart was less certain than my friend. Have I known time to creep so slowly? Each shifting shadow seemed endowed with life, each sigh of the air a whispered threat. I felt the cold seep into my very bones, yet Holmes appeared impervious, his attention fixed outward, as though the darkness itself were a page upon which he read. "Steady, Watson," he whispered once. "Nerves are a foe as deadly as any adversary. Let us trust to patience. Our quarry will not fail to appear." And so we waited, the stillness pressing upon us until my own heart's beating seemed unnaturally loud. It was near the turning of the hour when I first saw it. At the edge of the trees beyond the chapel wall, a pale glow trembled into view. Faint at first, then growing brighter as it drifted slowly toward us. My breath caught, and I felt the hairs rise at the back of my neck. "Holmes," I whispered hoarsely, pointing with a hand that shook despite myself. He inclined his head, his voice low and steady. "Yes, Watson, the play begins." The glow swayed gently, as though borne by invisible hands. It advanced with dreadful leisure, pausing now and then, only to resume its inexorable progress toward the ruin. The mist that hung low upon the ground seemed to catch the light, magnifying it, until the whole grove wore an unearthly radiance. My pulse quickened, and for one terrible moment I was back in the memory of the previous night, when the cloaked figure had glided across the lawn. The same illusion was upon us now, wrought with such skill that even I, who knew Holmes would strip it bare, could not wholly silence the cry of fear within me. Beside me, Holmes's hand closed firmly upon my sleeve. "Remember, Watson," he murmured, "terror blinds the senses. Attend not to the glow, but to its bearer." I forced my gaze lower, to the grass and the faint crunch of steps upon the frost. And there, half hidden beneath the shimmering haze, I saw it. The rhythm of a man's stride. Out of the pall of mist it came, slow and deliberate, as though conjured from the very earth beneath our feet. The figure was swathed in garments of white that seemed to shimmer faintly with their own light, casting a sickly radiance upon the ruined stones. Its form wavered oddly, now clear, now half obliterated by drifting vapour, so that I could scarce determine whether I looked upon mortal substance or some grotesque shadow of the spirit world. It moved with measured tread, gliding across the frost-bound grass until it stood within the broken archway of the chapel. The pale glow spread outward, painting the ivy-clad walls in eerie hues and filling the nave with a dim, spectral gleam. My breath caught in my throat.
Though my reason cried out against belief, some primal terror seized hold of me, and I could no longer doubt that we stood in the presence of the apparition which had so tormented our client. The tall figure inclined its head with solemn gravity, its face obscured, its every gesture charged with dreadful portent. Behind us, the night lay silent, as though the very air had stilled to witness the phantom's passage. I confess that in that moment, my heart quailed, and the revolver at my side seemed the only anchor to human courage left me. Almost without volition, my hand went to my pocket and closed upon the revolver that rested there. The weapon's cold steel seemed a comfort amid that unearthly glow. If the figure advanced upon us, I was prepared to meet it with lead, whether it were ghost or man. Yet before I could raise the barrel, I felt Holmes's firm grasp upon my wrist. His voice, low but commanding, cut through my agitation. "Steady, Watson. Do not waste powder upon shadows." I turned to him, astonished, for his face betrayed no trace of fear. His eyes, sharp and unwavering, remained fixed upon the apparition, as though it were some curious insect pinned beneath glass. Saw that the light wavered, casting uneven shadows upon the stones, unlike any natural radiance. The figure's garments, too, though long and flowing, clung in places like coarse wool, not ethereal vapour. The apparition raised one arm slowly, and a moan, hollow and prolonged, issued through the ruins. A woman in the village would have fainted at such a sound, but Holmes only smiled faintly. "A trumpet, Watson," he said. "A cheap device, but effective where superstition does the rest." The calm precision of his deductions steadied me somewhat, though the eerie glow and solemn gestures still chilled my blood. For all my training as a man of science, I could not shake the feeling that we trespassed in regions best left unvisited by the living. Even as we watched, the phantom began to retreat, gliding backward toward the far arch. The glow dimmed, the mist thickened, and within moments the figure was gone, swallowed into the blackness of the ruins. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sigh of the wind through the broken rafters. I released a long breath, scarcely aware until then that I had been holding it. Holmes rose, brushing the frost from his knees. "So vanishes our ghost, Watson, at least for the moment. But phantoms leave traces, and I mean to find them when daylight returns. By dawn we shall follow his path, and then we shall see who plays at haunting Blackwood Hall." His words, calm and confident, dispelled something of the dread that had weighed upon me. Yet I confess the memory of that luminous figure lingered long in my mind. The morning following our vigil dawned bleak and joyless, and with it came a palpable unease that settled over Blackwood Hall like a funeral pall. I observed the servants as they moved about their tasks with downcast eyes and hushed voices, each glance darting nervously toward the windows, as though expecting to glimpse the spectral figure once more drifting across the lawns. Even the scullery maids, usually inclined to chatter, went about their work in silence, their pallor betraying the sleepless hours of the night before. Henry Blackwood himself presented an even more pitiful spectacle. The young heir's hands shook so violently that he scarce could manage his morning tea, and his eyes, ringed with shadows, darted from corner to corner as though he feared his father's spirit might step forth from the panelling. I confess that I pitied him, for the strain upon his nerves was plain to all. The house, in truth, had become a place of whispered dread. Footsteps seemed louder than they should, and the groaning of the old timbers evoked sudden starts among the staff. Even I,
though resolved to cleave to reason, could not but feel the oppressive atmosphere of doom that hung over us. Yet in Holmes there was no such disturbance. His eyes gleamed with the cool light of calculation, and it was clear that in his mind the phantom was no shade from beyond the grave, but rather a creature of flesh and blood that would, in due course, betray itself. Holmes's manner grew more exacting as the day advanced. He bade Henry Blackwood remain ever within sight of either himself or me, warning that the peril lay not in apparitions, but in very tangible hands that sought his ruin. Henry listened with trembling lips, and though Holmes's words might have been meant to fortify him, I could see that each stern warning only deepened the young man's terror. "Courage, sir," Holmes said brusquely. "It is not the dead who endanger you, but the living, and the living are infinitely more vulnerable to discovery." In the afternoon, Holmes made a meticulous inspection of the great hall, noting the arrangement of furniture, the position of lamps, and above all the enormous chandelier that hung from its iron chain in the centre. He scrutinized the chain, stationed ourselves beneath the chandelier, whose myriad crystals caught the flickering lamplight and cast 1,000 distorted figures upon the walls. It was as though we were surrounded by a spectral company, each shadow moving with a stealthy life of its own. Henry Blackwood sat stiffly upon a carved oak chair, his hands gripping the armrests with a desperation that betrayed his agitation. I stood close beside him, listening to the faint crackle of the lamps and the distant sigh of the wind threading through the chimneys. Holmes, for his part, remained upright and alert, his gaze continually sweeping the recesses of the chamber, now fixed upon the rafters above, now upon the darkened stair. More than once I started at some trivial sound, the settling of the timbers, or the flutter of a bat disturbed from its roost. Each time Holmes merely raised a hand for silence, his face calm yet intent. There was about him that air of still anticipation I had witnessed upon the battlefield, in men who waited for the first cannon's roar. The minutes crept by, heavy with suspense. The great chamber seemed to throb with expectancy, and my nerves, already frayed by the previous night's encounter, tingled with every flicker of the flame. Then, somewhere in the unseen distance, there came a faint metallic creak, so slight that I doubted my own ears. Holmes's head turned sharply upward, and I knew in that instant that the trap was tightening, though its jaws had not yet sprung. It was in that suffocating silence, with the lamps flickering like dying sentinels, that a sudden exclamation escaped Henry Blackwood's lips. Following the direction of his trembling hand, I perceived at the far end of the chamber a faint and wavering light, as though some phosphorescent body drifted slowly into view. In another instant the figure resolved itself into that same ghostly semblance which had so unsettled us in the grounds, tall, shrouded, and gleaming with a pallid radiance that seemed more unearthly than ever beneath the cavernous roof of the hall. The servants who had been stationed at the door shrank back with muffled cries, crossing themselves as the luminous spectre advanced a step, then another, its movements strangely irregular, as if it swayed between substance and shadow. Henry clutched my arm with such force that the blood almost ceased to circulate, and I confessed that my own heart leapt into my throat. Yet even as terror seized the company, I caught sight of Holmes. He did not stare at the figure as we did, but rather allowed his keen gaze to travel rapidly about the chamber, from the apparition to the lamps, to the rafters, and at last upward to the chain from which the chandelier hung. His nostrils flared slightly, and I knew from long familiarity with his moods that some peril more immediate than the spectral intruder had already declared itself to his sharpened senses. The phantom raised one gleaming arm as though in command or warning, and the entire household seemed transfixed. But Holmes's sudden tightening of the jaw warned me that this apparition, however artfully contrived, was meant only to distract our eyes from some darker stroke about to fall.
even as the thought formed, a harsh metallic groan rent the air, followed by a shriek from one of the maids. I looked up in horror to see the enormous chandelier lurch upon its chain, sway outward, and then, with an appalling violence, plunge downward toward the very spot where Henry Blackwood sat frozen in terror. I scarcely remember how I sprang forward, but in that instant, instinct triumphed over reason. Seizing Henry by the shoulders, I dragged him bodily from the chair, and together we fell in a heap upon the flagstones. The next second, the iron mass struck with a thunderous crash, shattering the oak table beneath it and sending a storm of glass and twisted metal clattering across the floor. The air filled with dust, the acrid stench of oil from the shattered lamps, and the screams of the servants who rushed pell-mell from the hall. For several moments I could hear nothing but the frantic pounding of my own heart. Henry lay gasping beside me, his face as white as the apparition that had so nearly served as his death warrant. My arm smarted from a flying shard of glass, but save for this, closer. "Observe, Watson," he said, his voice low but quick. "This chain has not parted through age or weakness. See here, the link has been filed almost clean through, then set in place with a thin paste of rust and grease to disguise the work. A tug at the right moment, perhaps from a cord cleverly attached, and the whole structure would descend like the sword of Damocles upon our unfortunate client." I bent closer and saw, indeed, the unmistakable score marks of a file upon the iron, as fresh as though the villain had been at work but yesterday. Holmes dropped lightly to the floor and proceeded to turn over the shattered fragments, pausing now and then to scrutinize a fastening or a splintered beam. At last he picked up a length of wire no thicker than a violin string, which had been half concealed among the debris. "The hand that staged this accident," said he, "is of no ordinary cunning. We are dealing not with a wandering shade, but with an adversary of flesh and intellect, who cloaks his crime beneath a veil of superstition. The phantom is but a puppet. The true menace stands unseen behind the curtain." He straightened, brushing the dust from his coat. His eyes met mine with a gleam of satisfaction. "Come, Watson. Our quarry has revealed more in this single stroke than he might have wished. The net begins to close." The following evening found us once more assembled in the sombre library of Blackwood Hall, its heavy curtains drawn against the wind that rattled the casements, and the fire in the grate casting uneasy shadows upon the ranks of ancient tomes. Holmes had requested the presence of every soul beneath that roof, and so it was that Henry Blackwood, pale and drawn, stood at his side. The housekeeper and 2 remaining footmen lingered by the door, while I, stationed somewhat apart, kept my gaze upon my friend, sensing that the hour of revelation was at hand. Holmes leaned lightly upon the mantel, his figure calm and deliberate, and his keen eyes surveyed the company with that air of authority which even the most sceptical seldom resisted. "We have," said he, "been the unwilling actors in a drama whose stagecraft has been elaborate, but whose author is of flesh and blood. Tonight, the curtain falls." At these words, Henry uttered a faint cry, half of dread, half of relief, and the servants shifted uneasily. For weeks they had lived in terror of a phantom. Now Holmes promised to strip the spectre of its disguise. The fire hissed as a log collapsed into embers, and I could almost feel the collective breath of the room held in expectation. Holmes allowed the silence to deepen, his hands steepled before him, before continuing in measured tones. "The mystery of the so-called ghost rests not in the grave, but in the oldest of human motives." Holmes began his recital with that precision of mind which I had so often admired. "Let us take the evidence step by step," said he. "First, the footprints in the frost, beginning bravely upon soft earth, yet vanishing upon the stones. They did not vanish by miracle, but because the culprit passed into the secret passage, whose entrance lay cunningly hidden behind the library panelling.
Next, the wax. A candle stub and its telltale drippings guided us from the ruins of the chapel, proving that the luminous figure was no wandering shade, but a man who carried his own false moonlight. Phosphorus upon the garments, as I detected by its irregular flicker, completed the illusion of the supernatural. Henry shifted uneasily, and Holmes with a glance pressed on. Then came the letters, purporting to be from the dead hand of Sir Reginald. Yet, by my glass, the forgeries betrayed themselves in hesitation strokes, as though one mimicked a familiar script rather than lived it. To frighten you, Mr. Blackwood, into abandoning your inheritance, these communications were devised. A murmur escaped the servants, but Holmes's voice rose over it. Finally, the chandelier. It was no accident of age. A link, filed and dressed to resemble honest corrosion, had been prepared long in advance. The phantom's sudden law. Henry staggered, his lips parting as though to speak, but no sound emerged. The housekeeper gave a faint moan, as if some half-remembered rumour had sprung to life before her eyes. Holmes's voice, calm and relentless, pressed on. This Elias, denied name and fortune, nurtured a grievance that festered into malice. He is no shade from beyond, but a living man who has stalked these corridors in shroud and phosphorus, hoping to unseat you, Henry, by fear and by fraud, to send you fleeing in terror, leaving the estate ripe for his grasp. That was his object. He drew from his pocket the torn scrap of cloak we had found in the passage and held it aloft. This fabric matches none within the house, but I traced its weave to a tailor in Whitechapel. The purchaser gave no name, but his description tallies with one who has been seen of late in the neighbouring hamlet. The room seemed to shrink beneath the gravity of Holmes's words. Henry pressed a hand to his brow, pale as the dead, while the servants whispered in awe. The phantom of Blackwood Hall had a name, and it was human. Holmes had scarcely concluded his account when he turned to me with that swift, decisive manner which always heralded action. "Watson, the lamps, if you please. Lower them to a murmur." I obeyed at once, shading the light until the library lay steeped in half-darkness, the fire alone casting its dull glow upon the hearth. We had scarcely drawn breath before a stir came at the threshold. A wavering glow, pale and ghastly, stealing through the gap in the door. It grew, until the outline of a figure in shrouds stood before us, its garments faintly luminous, its hands outstretched in dreadful supplication. Henry gave a strangled cry, while one of the maids sank to her knees, muttering a prayer. Holmes, however, did not flinch. With the swiftness of a striking hawk, he sprang forward, his hand closing upon the apparition's arm. The figure struggled, emitting a hoarse snarl that no ghost of my knowledge had ever uttered. Chairs overturned as the two wrestled in the dim light, but Holmes, wiry and resolute, bore his opponent into the centre of the room. "Watson, the lamps to full," he commanded. In an instant I threw open the shades, and brilliance flooded the chamber. There, in the blaze of fire and lamp, the phantom writhed in Holmes's grasp, no spirit of the departed, but a man of flesh and blood. Under Holmes's unyielding grip, the false spectre was forced down upon the rug. The servants gasped, craning forward as Holmes tore at the figure's garments. The luminous shrouds, clammy with chemical paste, gave off their sickly glow as he stripped them away, revealing the angular frame and hollow features of a man. His eyes glared with a ferocity that was half madness, and the stench of phosphorus hung heavy in the air. "Elias Blackwood," Holmes declared, his voice ringing clear through the stunned silence. "Illegitimate son of Sir Reginald, and the architect of this elaborate imposture." The man spat a curse, his thin lips twisting. "It should have been mine," he hissed. "The hall, the land, all stolen from me by law and by birth. Why should that puling boy have everything, while I skulk in shadows?" He strained against Holmes, but his strength, wasted by years of bitterness and concealment, could not match the detective's iron restraint. Holmes motioned to the footman, who, emboldened, stepped forward and bound the prisoner's arms with a cord snatched from the curtain. I confess my own heart thudded in my chest at the sight. The ghost that had haunted these halls, the terror that had driven men to desert their posts and nearly cost Henry his life, was revealed as no more than a gaunt, embittered man in a costume of deceit. And yet the venom in his eyes suggested that no phantom could have been more dangerous. Henry Blackwood shrank back against the library table, his face ashen and his lips trembling. For a long moment he could only stare at candor. Blood may bind, but actions condemn. The young heir nodded faintly, as though clinging to Holmes's words as a lifeline. Relief struggled with revulsion in his countenance, yet I sensed that the nightmare's hold upon him had at last been broken. Holmes straightened his coat, his keen eyes surveying the room now thick with relief and wonder. "You see, Watson," said he, "there are no spirits abroad in Blackwood Hall, save those conjured by envy and resentment. What has been taken for the whisper of the dead is but the artifice of the living." He gestured to the discarded shrouds, still faintly gleaming in the lamplight. Phosphorus daubed upon linen, a candle's glow refracted through trickery. Footsteps carried through hidden ways. These are the tools of men, not of phantoms. Ghosts, my dear fellow, are but shadows cast by men's darkest ambitions. Henry, pale though steadier now, inclined his head in gratitude, while the servants murmured blessings upon Holmes's name. As I looked upon the gaunt prisoner, his eyes smouldering with futile hatred, I felt the truth of my friend's words. It is not the dead who haunt us most, but the living, who cannot let their grievances lie buried. It was not in Holmes's nature to let a matter of justice rest with a mere unmasking. Having secured our prisoner, he ordered the footman to bring lanterns, and with Henry and myself at his side, we escorted the wretched figure through the draughty corridors and out into the bitter night. The wind howled across the grounds, carrying with it a scatter of leaves that hissed against the flagstones, while above us the moon peered through tatters of cloud like an unwelcome witness. Our destination was the ruined chapel that stood some distance from the hall, a relic of bygone centuries, whose stones now leaned with age and neglect. Its crumbling arches, choked with ivy, presented a fitting theatre for the grim confrontation about to unfold. As we drew near, the prisoner struggled, once, twice, but Holmes's grasp was iron, and the man, gasping, relented. Inside the ruin the air hung heavy, damp with mould, and echoing with the faint drip of water from the fractured roof. Shadows clung to the broken altar and pulled in the corners, so that the lantern light seemed feeble and uncertain. It was here, in that desolate place, that Holmes chose to strip the masquerade of its last pretense and demand a full account. The fellow stood panting, his breast heaving beneath the remnants of his soiled cloak. Patches of phosphorus yet gleamed upon the cloth, lending him in that moment a ghastly, half-supernatural air, as though he hovered still between ghost and man. His hair, lank and disordered, clung to his damp brow, and his eyes, fierce with hate, darted from one to another of us, as though seeking some avenue of escape. But there was none. The chapel doors were broken, the windows empty of glass, and Holmes himself, lantern raised, blocked the only passage outward. "Your masquerade is ended," said my friend with the quiet force of command. "There will be no more hauntings at Blackwood Hall. Speak now, or the law will wring the truth from you in less forgiving fashion." The man's shoulders sagged, though the defiance did not altogether leave his gaze. His lips curled in a bitter smile. "So the clever detective has his triumph. Very well. You shall have my story. though it condemns me further. For I am Elias Blackwood, son of Sir Reginald, though no priest blessed the union that gave me life. I was cast out before I could walk, yet the blood of Blackwood runs in my veins as surely as it does in his. Here he pointed a trembling hand at Henry, who recoiled as if struck. What followed was less a confession than an eruption of pent-up rage. The man's voice rang harsh against the chapel's bare stone, echoing as though the walls themselves were made to bear witness to his grievance. "All my life," he cried, "I have worn the brand of bastardy. While Henry slept in feathered cradles, I knew the chill of the gutter. While he learned his letters at fine schools, last subsided. And in so doing you prove not the power of your cause, but the poverty of your conscience." The prisoner sank against the wall, his anger spent, his eyes burning still, but dulled by the certainty of his defeat. At Holmes's quiet prompting, the man's tale took a darker, more deliberate turn. His voice, though cracked with fatigue, carried the cold pride of one who believed his cunning deserved admiration. "You wonder at the letters," he said, his eyes fixed on Henry with a savage gleam. "They were my finest work. I stole into the study weeks before Sir Reginald's death, taking scraps of his hand from discarded notes. With patient toil, by candlelight in lodgings meaner than you can imagine, I practiced each curl and stroke, until even I scarce knew where his pen ended and mine began. I pressed them upon paper aged in smoke, folded them as he had done, and sealed them with wax stolen from the hall. Each line was calculated to chill your blood, Henry. Threats clothed in a father's hand, urging you to flee the house that should have been mine." He laughed bitterly, the sound echoing among the broken arches. "And you believed them, did you not? You felt the touch of the grave in every word. I saw it in your eyes when we met by chance in the village. You feared the dead had risen, when all along it was only Elias Blackwood taking his rightful revenge." Holmes, unmoved, observed in his dry way, "A clumsy forgery in parts, but sufficient for a mind already unbalanced by fear. Terror often does the criminal's labour for him." Henry flinched as though the words themselves were blows, and I confess that I too had felt the chill of those letters in my own hands. "Letters were but the beginning," Elias continued, his voice trembling now with the fervour of confession. "To haunt a man, one must give him more than ink. He must see, he must hear. I scoured the city for ingredients, for garments coarse enough to hold the phosphorus I smeared upon them. At night I would slip into this passage." He struck the wall with his bound hand, "and emerge at will behind the chapel or within the library, where shadows serve a masquerader better than any stage." He spoke with a twisted pride, almost forgetting his bonds. The glow was simple enough, phosphorus mixed with oil, painted in streaks to give the illusion of a wavering form. Too much, and it burned with steady fire. Too little, and the trick was lost. I bore candles shielded in glass, the wax dripping to mark my path. From afar I must have seemed a soul suspended between light and darkness. And when the bell in the tower tolled with the wind's aid, I let the sound cloak my steps. I shuddered despite myself, recalling that first glimpse of the phantom in the garden mist. It had chilled my very marrow. Holmes alone smiled faintly. "A conjurer's art upon a country stage," said he. "Enough to unnerve, but never enough to withstand the light of reason." His voice, which had burned with furious pride, grew lower, more measured, as he spoke of the last and most terrible deed. The ghost alone would not suffice. Terror weakens, but death silences. I marked the chandelier weeks ago, its chain worn with rust. With a file and acid I weakened the link further, disguising my handiwork with dust so that no eye would suspect. At the appointed hour, while you sat trembling in the hall, I crept above through the passage, my glow drawing all eyes to the far end. The chain gave way with the merest touch, and down it came. He leaned forward, his gaunt features alight with a dreadful satisfaction. Had you not been dragged aside, Henry, your body would lie cold upon the flags, crushed beneath the iron that lit your father's house. The ghost would have vanished into the ruins, and all would have called it accident. The hall cursed indeed. Henry turned deaf.
"See that the constable in the village is summoned," he said quietly. "Our part here is done." As they moved to comply, I could not help but feel a chill that no lantern could dispel. For though the ghost of Blackwood Hall was laid to rest, its memory, born of envy and bitterness, would haunt us for many nights to come. It was with no small sense of relief that Holmes and I quitted the shadowed grounds of Blackwood Hall. The matter having passed into the hands of the local constabulary, we made our way to the little station at dawn, Henry Blackwood pale but composed as he pressed Holmes's hand in gratitude. The young heir had survived both the assaults upon his life and the revelation of a brother's malice. Yet I knew the memory of those nights would cling to him long after the law had spoken its final word. The train bore us swiftly back toward London, the bleak countryside sliding past under a pallid winter sun. Holmes, as ever after such exertions, relapsed into silence, his keen eyes half closed, as though his mind were already engaged upon some abstruse calculation. I, for my part, allowed the rhythm of the wheels to soothe me, and more than once I caught myself dozing, my thoughts still entangled with spectral figures moving through misty gardens. When at last the cab deposited us once more at Baker Street, I confess that no sight had ever seemed more welcome than the familiar curtains, the cluttered mantle, and the cheerful smoke curling from the chimney above. After the gloom of that accursed house, 221B was to me as a haven of warmth and sanity. That evening, after we had dined in our accustomed fashion, Holmes drew his chair close to the fire, his long legs stretched before him, and his pipe between his fingers. The smoke curled upward in slow spirals, wreathing his angular features in an atmosphere of calm abstraction. His hawk-like profile, illumined by the glow of the flames, presented once more that curious blend of languor and suppressed vitality which never failed to strike me. For my own part, I had opened my journal and sat with pen poised, eager to commit to paper the singular events through which we had lately passed. It has ever been my practice to record such matters while their impressions lie fresh upon the mind, and the Blackwood case, with its mingling of terror and fraud, seemed destined to take its place among the most curious of our adventures. Holmes observed my industry with the faintest smile. "Your pen, Watson," said he, "is a far surer vehicle for the marvellous than all the paraphernalia of false phantoms. Yet I should not discourage the chronicler. The world loves a ghost as much as it loves a deduction." I laughed, though inwardly I felt the truth of his remark, for even as I dipped my pen once more, the image of the glowing apparition at the chapel ruins rose vividly before me, as though it were unwilling to be laid to rest. Holmes roused himself from his reverie at length, and spoke with that measured cadence which always compelled attention. "Let us, Watson, if only to settle the matter in our minds, review the links of the chain which led us to the culprit. It is in the orderly arrangement of facts, rather than their isolated marvel, that true detection resides." He leaned forward, the firelight striking his sharp features. "First, the footprints in the frost, beginning where no man should walk and vanishing upon the stones. This pointed not to the supernatural, but to a hidden means of exit, the secret passage we later uncovered. Next, the candle stub and its scattered wax. Trivial to the casual eye, yet to me, proof that a man, not a spectre, had carried his own source of light. Then, the forged letters. I remarked at once the hesitations in the script, the tremors of one imitating rather than remembering his own hand. They were the work of a forger, not of the grave. He drew on his pipe and continued. The phosphorescent garments, daubed with chemical preparation, provided the illusion of a glowing figure. Combine this with the concealment of the passage and the tolling of the ruined bell, and you have the full apparatus of a ghost. And lastly, the chandelier, so artfully weakened. That, Watson, was no caprice of fate, but the hand of a murderer. Damp air. It is another to stand in the midnight hush, with shadows lengthening and the cry of the wind about the stones, and to behold a figure, wavering, as though it belonged neither to flesh nor to spirit. Even now, in the safety of Baker Street, the recollection of that unearthly light seemed to creep along my nerves. Holmes, catching perhaps some shade of my disquiet, gave me a sidelong glance. "You are still haunted, Watson," said he quietly. "I own it," I replied, smiling somewhat ruefully. "Your logic convinces the mind, but memory is a trickster, and mine insists upon lending that apparition a touch of the otherworldly." Holmes gave no answer, but his pipe glowed anew, the silence between us inviting reflection. At length, Holmes removed the pipe from his lips and spoke, his tone softened by the firelight. "You err, Watson, in supposing that the supernatural was ever at work. The phosphorescence was but chemistry, the whispers were contrived, the footsteps, guided by a hidden passage. No spirit intruded at Blackwood Hall, save the spirit of malice harboured by a living man." He leaned forward, his keen eyes fixed upon me. "The dead rarely return, Watson. They are at peace, for good or ill. It is the living who haunt us most, those who cannot lay aside envy, resentment, or thwarted ambition. Such passions cling more tenaciously than any chain of the grave. They poison households, unsettle heirs, and dress themselves in spectral guise, when simple hatred might seem too bare." I nodded, struck by the gravity of his words. Holmes continued. "Elias Blackwood chose to masquerade as his father's shade, but it was not the phantom of Sir Reginald that stalked those halls. It was Elias's own bitterness, given form by trickery. That, my dear fellow, is the truer ghost. A man who will not bury his rancour, who walks among us more dreadful than any apparition of folklore." For a moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. Holmes's gaze softened, and he settled back into his chair with the air of one who had closed not merely a case, but a chapter in human folly. I laid aside my pen and regarded my companion with renewed admiration. Never had I seen more clearly the singular blend of intellect and moral perception that made Sherlock Holmes the man he was. Others might have rejoiced merely in the exposure of the trick, in the capture of a criminal. But Holmes, with his rare insight, sought always the deeper lesson, the revelation of human motives cloaked in crime. The glow of the fire flickered across the familiar walls of our sitting room, casting the shadows of violin and chemical retorts in benign silhouette. How far we had travelled from the cold stones of Blackwood Hall, with its corridors steeped in dread and its air heavy with deceit. Here, in the cheerful disorder of Baker Street, the shadows seemed powerless to intrude. Holmes stretched his long limbs with a faint smile. "You see, Watson," said he, "the world is full enough of mysteries without our summoning phantoms to swell the number. Facts, when rightly arranged, are always more astonishing than fictions." I could not but agree. And so, as the clock chimed the hour and the city murmured beyond the window, I felt that, however dark the roads we travelled, the light of Baker Street remained constant, a brilliance unclouded even by the gloomiest apparitions of Blackwood Hall.
Holmes leaned back in his chair, the glow of the fire soft upon his austere features. "You see, Watson," he said, "men will conjure phantoms where none exist, but it is envy, not ectoplasm, that truly haunts a house. Elias Blackwood's crime was not born of the grave, but of a heart that could not bury its bitterness."
And so I put the question to you. What do you believe was the villain's greatest folly? His reliance on fear, his forged hand, or the pride that blinded him to Holmes's reason? Share your thoughts below, and if you enjoyed unraveling this mystery, I invite you to comment, subscribe, and pass this tale along to fellow lovers of deduction. After all, the game is always best when shared.